Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, you wouldn't ordinarily think that Connecticut has a lot in common with the Asian nation of Sumatra, but it turns out that over 1% of Connecticut's land holdings, feels just like Sumatra. And wait until you hear the reason why. Our guest today is John Cilio. He's a professional public speaker with a long litany of topics that he features as a guest lecturer. Now, on this particular episode, he's going to discuss a topic that he's researched extensively, tobacco farming. Turns out it's one of Connecticut's most important agricultural crops. And wait until you hear the backstory behind how it got started. John will be along in just a minute. This week's trivia question: well, you take it routinely now when you're sick, but the first time somebody took this new medication was right here in Connecticut. Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. When you think of royalty, these days the name Windsor comes to mind. That's the name of the royal family in Great Britain, which just happens to be the longest-running monarchy in the world. None can touch it, none is better at it. Well, you can say the same thing about the cigar wrapper leaves that are growing in the very selective soil here in Connecticut. There simply isn't anything quite as good anywhere else in the world. And the soil type, as declared by the federal government, just happens to be called Windsor soil. Now, that's after the town where it was first used to grow tobacco in Connecticut, the town of Windsor. Now, Connecticut wasn't always the best in this field. In fact, for a long time, Connecticut was considered, frankly, a somewhat inferior cigar wrapper manufacturing region. But all that changed about 125 years ago, and the state hasn't looked back since. Now, wait until you hear how a Connecticut first, namely bringing advanced science to the field of agriculture way back in the 1800s, turned the tide around, allowing Connecticut to beat back competition from that tiny Asian nation of Sumatra, which had been running circles around us up until that point. And wait until you hear from our guest today just how much of the market Connecticut controls. It's downright impressive. John Cilio is a professional public speaker. He's one of those truly engaging speakers who's mesmerizing from the opening gates. There are a litany of topics in which John specializes, and today he's here to focus on tobacco farming in Connecticut, which just happens to be a very important crop for the state, and one of its oldest, and as you're going to hear, predates the arrival of European settlers. John, Connecticut has been at the forefront of tobacco in terms of an agricultural product really since the inception, since European settlers arrived. Now, maybe you're going to surprise me and say that Native Americans were growing it as well, but I think this was a European introduction in the 1600s. Let's start there. Tell us about what was happening in this state roughly 400 years ago in terms of the tobacco industry.
Well, interestingly enough, the Native Americans did grow tobacco in Connecticut, and they're the people that taught the settlers in Windsor, which was the first town settled in Connecticut, how to grow it. They were growing a different tobacco. It's called Ristico, and it's slightly bitter, and it's peppery, and the settlers were used to Virginia pipe tobacco, so they grew this Ristico for a little while. By the way, it has 9 times the nicotine of the Virginia tobacco. And after really just a very short time, the settlers in Windsor started growing Virginia-based tobacco, which was much smoother, but they learned the techniques from the natives.
Fascinating. Now, please define for us the difference between the tobacco that's inside the leaf and the leaf that goes around the tobacco that you smoke. Is there a difference between the type of tobacco, or do they use the same tobacco for the wrapper?
There's three types of tobacco used. And the outer layer, so if you look at a cigar, that's called the wrapper. And Connecticut wrappers are typically a very light brown. And that wrapper, its purpose is several things. One, if you run a cigar underneath your nose, you're smelling the wrapper tobacco. And it has a feel to it. There's no veins and there's no blemishes. Blemishes, if you think of a 2x4, you'll see a knot. Well, if there's a blemish in a leaf, it isn't used for the wrapper. And underneath that wrapper is something called a binder. And it's a thicker, more elastic leaf, and it provides the body to the cigar. It holds together what's inside, which is called filler. And there's two types of fillers. One of them is called short filler, the other is long filler. And think of short filler typically used in a lower price cigar. And it's kind of like a hot dog. They chop up tobacco and it's put into the cigar. But it's all kinds of tobaccos. And the long filler, typically used in more expensive cigars, are leaf that are cut in a long row and then they're rolled into the cigar so it burns the full length of the cigar. It's actually mixed like a fine wine. The designer of a cigar will say, I want to mix for this filler of 30% one brand and 30% another. And the combination of the wrapper, the binder, and the filler make today's cigars, and they have forever, actually.
So if I am a tobacco farmer in Connecticut, I'm growing three different types of tobacco?
No, almost all of the tobacco grown in Connecticut is wrapper. Some of our tobacco is used for binder, and they're the two most expensive, so you have a better margin. And the filler tobaccos come from lots of different places. And we have really three kinds that we grow today. The shade tobacco, something called broadleaf that came here in 1830s, and then something called Havana, which came in the 1870s.
Now, we don't actually make the cigars here in Connecticut, or do we?
Almost all of it gets shipped to South America because it's cured in Connecticut. That's where you see the barns along the Connecticut River. And after the curing, which brings it to that very soft, leathery feel, golden color that you see on a cigar, most of it is shipped to South America where they put it in bulks, which are 1,500-pound piles of tobacco that are turned. It's called fermentation, and it helps get some of the ammonia out, and it lets the, good or bad, the tars and nicotines that naturally occur in the leaf to come out more boldly. It helps make it a more even burn. So it goes to South America for that process, and then it will come back. People can buy it by individual pounds, actually, if you want to, but it's sold in bundles of 155 pounds.
One of the things that has put Connecticut on the map is the soil. I drew a parallel in my mind to wine. So if you go to France and they use the term terroir as terms of the types of soil they grow, particular types of grapes, and how important that is, I was fascinated to find out from you that there was a stretch of soil, I guess, going from Greenwich up to Vermont along the Connecticut River that is absolutely critical to this industry. Could you explain that entire topic?
It's called Windsor soil. It was given that name in 1899 when the national government did a soil survey across the country. And Windsor soil is actually found all over the world. It is a soil that has about 5% clay content, and it's very permeable. The Windsor soil in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont comes from what was an ancient lake, Lake Hitchcock. And it's the sandiest, deepest spots of that lake which come as soil from the glaciers. And it's unique. In Connecticut, there's 34,000 acres of Windsor soil, and it's the Connecticut River a little bit along the Housatonic and a little bit along the coast. In Connecticut, there's 3.5 million square acres, and only 34,000 are Windsor soil. And it's so important that when Connecticut discovered the idea of using tents, other states had great, Florida in particular. So they started tenting their tobacco, but because their soil is different, it didn't emulate the kind of tobacco wrapper that they were trying to compete against, so it didn't work in Florida. So the soil really is crucial. It drains very quickly when it's sandy, and the roots of a tobacco plant aren't deep, and they thrive in that kind of soil.
Now, I was fascinated to hear your response. For the benefit of the listeners, you and I exchanged some information by email before this interview, and you told me about the importance of shade, and I, rather smart alecky way, said, gee, isn't it funny that you burn a cigar, but then you have to put it in the shade when you grow it? And you had an answer that just blew me away, and it involves Sumatra. Tell me all about that.
Yeah, so Connecticut was a leader in wrapper because the margins are so good. Farmers, of course, like growing shade tobacco as wrapper. Well, in the 1890s, all of a sudden there's this country in the Philippine area called Sumatra, and they're growing tobacco. They don't have Windsor soil, interestingly enough. They have volcanic soil, but people like their wrapper better. It was thinner, it had less veins, it was non-blemished, and they took the market. We were still selling wrapper, but we didn't get the premium price. So people were like, huh, why? They bought seed from Sumatra and grew it in Connecticut. It didn't work. It burned under our sun. So people were kind of scratching their heads. How can they figure this out? Why can't we grow premium tobacco leaf? Connecticut in 1875 was the first state to bring forward the agricultural experiment station. They were actually brought into place to solve some fraud that was taking place in the fertilizer industry. And it's a series of scientists and things, and they got interested in the problem that Connecticut was having with its tobacco. And they sent people to Sumatra to look at the weather. It's cloudy most of the time and hazy most of the time, so there's a natural barrier for the sun to get to the tobacco leaf. So they had this idea of the tents, first to shield the sun, but also to increase the humidity. We think of shade tents as you go under a tree, it's a little cooler, but actually inside those tents, it's warmer and it's much more humid. So it emulates the environment of Sumatra. And when they did that in 1899 and 1900, they were surprised. And in 1901, they physically grew tobacco to be tested against the Sumatra wrappers, and people couldn't tell the difference.
One fact about tobacco that I still have trouble believing is that just 2 tablespoons of seeds will generate 10,000 pounds of tobacco. Is that true?
It is. Seeds are very, very small. To give you a flavor, an ounce of seeds is 300,000 seeds. That's how small they are. They're very productive. Tobacco, when it's planted, grows on average an inch a day. It can grow 4 inches a day in the right climate situation with rain and sun, and those seeds are really powerful. And the Spanish, who were the people that actually promoted tobacco after Columbus discovered it from the natives in South American area, they made it illegal to sell seed, punishable by death, is how important tobacco production was to the Spanish kingdom. And it was so easy to smuggle, because 2 tablespoons will give you more than an acre of tobacco. 100 acres of tobacco is 1 million plants. And if you think about shade tobacco being touched 12 to 15 times when you plant it to when you finish harvesting it, times 1 million plants and 100 acres. An amazing feat that what the farmers produce.
Now, if you're as old as I am, I remember as a young kid driving from Fairfield County, where I grew up, to Bradley Airport north of Hartford, and used to make that ride, and you would pass tobacco farm after tobacco farm after tobacco farm. And then as I grew up and got older, those started to disappear to the point where I thought that we were kind of done with the tobacco industry, and have learned very much so that we're not. And not to put you on the spot, but roughly, what percentage of Connecticut's agricultural business is tobacco? Do you know that statistic at all?
I know that it's in the billions of dollars. To give you a flavor, in the 1950s, two-thirds of all of the cigars made in America used Connecticut shade tobacco wrappers. In the 1950s, those tents you saw used 25 million square yards of fabric. It was cotton initially. Today it's synthetic. It takes about 5,000 square yards per acre. So you can imagine putting all that tenting up, and you do it every year. And we're down to about 700 acres, down from about 7,000 acres. And there's lots of reasons for it. As it turns out, Windsor soil also happens to be where Connecticut is developing commercially, the Hartford area, Windsor. So the land becomes so valuable that as a farm, it kind of gets outpriced. And farmers are constantly battling diseases. Every year, a new hybrid seed will come out to combat some mildew issues or fungus issues. But if you lose your crop, your profit cash stream has been dramatically impacted, or you have a bad hailstorm or a really bad windstorm that actually causes the tents to have problems. It's a delicate business, and farmers are just finding other alternatives, and it's really hard work.
One final area, which I, again, find fascinating. I find this whole topic fascinating. When we were back in the day, when religious institutions pretty much ran the government in Connecticut, they also had some pretty interesting rules about where you could smoke. And I guess I'm kind of surprised that tobacco did so well in this state, considering what some of those prohibitions and restrictions were. Can you outline what it was like if you wanted to smoke back in the, 1700s, 1800s in Connecticut?
It was really bad in the 1640s. So literally right after Windsor starts growing tobacco, the church-state government said, this isn't good. It doesn't bring food to the table, and it isn't helping people, so you shouldn't grow it. That was kind of the message. But people grew it. As an example, 1638, Virginia is shipping 3 million pounds of tobacco to England. Connecticut didn't even register. And what farmers did is they continued to grow it. In 1640, the first laws come out. And the laws say, one, you have to be 21 to smoke it. You couldn't smoke it in groups. In 1646, they actually repealed that law and made it stronger. And you couldn't smoke within 2 miles of a church on the Sabbath day. You couldn't smoke it in a tavern unless you were in a private room and not with more than one other person. Even worse, you couldn't smoke or take tobacco as snuff unless you were 10 miles away from your home. And there's some interesting illustrations in the old newspapers of the magistrate grabbing somebody. And, taverns, they were certainly for townspeople, but they were also inns. So people would be traveling through Connecticut for business, and they would be warned and sometimes arrested because they're smoking. Everyone smoked in all the taverns, except for in New England, because the church said you can't. I think it was 1650 it was actually outlawed, but people continued to grow it. And the reasons the farmers did, besides personal use, they could go to the coast when a ship came in and trade. If you needed shovels or wagons, things that weren't made in America, you could go to the ship and trade with the ship captain tobacco, because the ship captain knew that tobacco here was worth some price, but if he took that tobacco to Europe, it was worth another price. So it became the cash trading medium for farmers in Connecticut to get things that they couldn't produce themselves or buy locally. And by 1700, it was a major export of the state.
Wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Windsor, Simsbury, Suffolk, those are just three of the towns that grew quite a bit of tobacco in the early years and profited from the trade. Well, nowadays, as you heard, it's down to just 7,000 acres across the entire state. I want to thank our guest for today's program, John Cilio, a professional public speaker on a number of topics in which he has incredible expertise, such as you heard in this episode. If you want to get a hold of John, just drop me an email at amazingtalect@gmail.com, and I'll gladly make the introduction. The answer to this week's trivia question, well, the question was, you take it routinely now when you're sick, but the very first time somebody took this new medication was right here in Connecticut. The answer is penicillin. Yes, this groundbreaking antibiotic was first administered to a patient in the U.S. at Yale New Haven Hospital. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to have a specialist in infectious diseases from Yale New Haven Health who's going to tell us about this race against time story that saved that first patient's life. You won't want to miss it. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.